Thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Christabel Feeney. I'm the Director of Employers for Change at the Open Doors Initiative. Just see a visual descriptor of myself this morning. I am a white female with blue eyes and blonde hair, which is tied back in a low bun this morning. And I'm wearing a patterned dress, seated with a virtual background, purple background behind me with a white Employers for Change logo. So I'm really delighted to welcome all of you here today, virtually anyway, to today's session on stammering awareness. And that's with the Irish Stammering Association. So we're very grateful for them for being here today as well. But before I introduce our two speakers, I just want to advise people that the chat function you will see has been turned off, simply because that can sometimes interfere with people's ability to fully access the event and what's being said when there's a screen reader at play and when the chat function is turned on. So alternatively, if you have a question or you have a comment that you'd like to make, there is the Q&A function and you can use that. And at the end of the session then, when we finish the presentation, we will come back and we'll answer any of those questions that have come through on the Q&A function. You'll also see that live captioning has been enabled if you require it, and you can turn that on for yourself to see. And we're delighted as well to have Bernadette here today, who's our Irish Sign Language interpreter, and she should be visible on the screen at all times for people. Unfortunately, we may not be able to spotlight Bernadette and the person that's making the presentation while the screen is being shared, but you will certainly be able to see Bernadette as the ISL interpreter for the duration of the session. So our speakers this morning are Georgina Dunleavy and Aisling Keogh. Georgina is the Employment and Education Support Coordinator with the Irish Stammering Association, and she's been working with the organisation since 2019. She specialises in working individually with people who stammer, in supporting them to access and to progress in employment, and advocating for people who stammer in the workplace and in education. Aisling Keogh is qualified as a speech and language therapist from the University of Essex, Colchester, England. She has worked in both the private and the public sector, and Aisling is experienced in working with adults and children with communication delays and disorders, such as stuttering, specific speech and language delays and disorders, dysphonia, which is a hoarse voice, autism spectrum, and intellectual disability. So Aisling works with the Irish Stammering Association, and she's responsible for running a number of children and adult support groups. So I'm going to hand over now to Georgina and Aisling.
Thanks, Christabel. Just give an introduction to myself. My name is Georgina Dunleavy. I am a white female. I have long brownish blonde hair, brown eyes, and a blurred background. I'm also wearing a patterned top. I'm just going to share my screen. So, just to give a little bit of information about the Irish Stammering Association, we are a publicly funded organisation. We're funded primarily by Pobl, and we have a number of people working in our organisation, around 6 people in various roles. So myself as Employment and Education Coordinator, we also have a Youth Development Officer, Development Manager, Administration, and a number of other support functions. To give you a little understanding of the ISA itself, ISA is the nationally recognised organisation for people who stammer in Ireland. We are committed to building, developing, and supporting the stammering community, raising awareness of stammering, and being the trusted source of accurate and reliable information in Ireland. We do that in a number of ways. So we run a number of support groups. We have children's support groups, adult support groups, parent support groups. We also have employment and education support that I run. We do that through a number of one-to-one sessions with people, also a number of group sessions. We also work internationally with organizations such as 50 Million Voices on an employment perspective. And we also have a number of social events that we run throughout the year through our Walk and Talk event. And also this weekend, we have an ice skating event happening for our youth group in Blanchardstown. Last year, we also developed a podcast that is available on Spotify. And we also celebrate every year the International Stammering Awareness Day that happens in October. And that is a week-long celebration of events that happen online and in person. And this year we were delighted to get additional coverage on the 6 o'clock news about the event that we had happening in October in Kilmainham. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be looking at how to help you understand candidates who stammer, but this is also relevant, you know, how to help you understand people who stammer. So we'll also be looking at challenges for somebody who stammers and look at how we can go about creating a stammering inclusive workplace. We'll also look at how best to support somebody in interview, and then moving forward, and we'll finish up with some questions and answers. I'd like to hand you over now to my colleague, Aisling Keogh, who's going to take you through understanding somebody who stammers.
Hello, everybody. My name's Aisling Keogh. I'm a white female. I'm wearing a black jumper with a patterned collar. I have brown shoulder-length hair and blue eyes. The background here, I don't think you can actually see me here anyway, but when I come onto the screen later, there's a cream background as well. I am a speech and language therapist, and I have been working with the Irish Stammering Association since 2010 as their research officer. And what I'm going to talk to you today is around what stammering is and a few other aspects of how it impacts on the individual. Georgina, if you can just flick through the whole bit. And yeah. So stammering, that's great. Stammering is also known as stuttering or dysfluency. There's a lot of different names. Some people have their own name they call it as well. So some people like to call it a speech impediment, and some people, like for children, they may often call it bumpy speech. It is multifactorial in its origins, but we do know that it's a disruption to the timing and flow of speech when someone is talking. This speech disorder has genetic origins, especially in relation to children who have started stammering from a young age and have grown into adulthood. We know there's a strong genetic link there. There are neurological, psychological, and environmental elements. It does involve the involuntary loss of control, which is variable in its nature. Approximately 5% of children are known to stammer, and it typically develops when they're learning language and an explosion of vocabulary in their development. It's between the ages of 2 to 6 years. As this develops, about 1% of the adult population would identify themselves as having a stammer, and that's a ratio of 4 to 1. However, in the developmental, they do now consider it could be up to 50-50 between male to female. When I say 1% of the population of adults, it's just to note that is 50,000 people in Ireland, which is just over half of Croke Park. So it is quite a lot of people who may identify as having a stammer. Okay, I'm going to briefly talk about cluttering. This is a disorder of, it's a speech disorder as well. It is less common, less frequently identified for people, but it is related to stuttering. Really what the best way of identifying it is a rapid rate of speech. You know, many Irish people in particular have a very rapid rate of speech, but this is significantly different. This is where, you know, it can be recorded as being difficult to understand. There's syllables skipped when the words are spoken. Timing of speech can be inconsistent, pauses inconsistent. There is a reduced awareness of cluttering in the individual themselves. And we do know that it can result in a disrupted language plan. So the order of their sentence may appear disjointed. Some syllables may be skipped. A very good source for information on this is a website, toofastforwords.com, and the link is just there. So stuttering, moving back to stuttering, it's also known as stammering. It is complex and it is variable. We know that there are three main features, primary features that we identify, and I'm going to do an example of each of these, so just so you may understand it. So a block is when the words seem to get stuck in the individual. People feel a block coming on sometimes, while other people don't feel it at all. A block might be, for example, I'm going to the shops, and the word has a lengthy pause beforehand. Repetitions are when the first or the whole part of a word are repeated. So I'm going to the shops. And a prolongation is when part of the word is stretched out. These are the primary features of stammering, but there are a few other ones that I just didn't go into here. Secondary behaviors then, these are behaviors that we often see associated and have been long established in people who stammer. A loss of eye contact. So many people will stop looking at somebody when they're talking, or they might look away briefly. They may use starter or filler words, you know, kind of what's another word for it is fluent asides. So words they know can be fluent when they're talking. Many people will have body movements while they're talking. They may clench their hands or legs or tap their foot. Tension and struggle are significant features and behaviors for people who stammer. And the reaction to these primary behaviors is a feature as well. Another characteristic is avoidance, avoiding words, avoiding sounds, avoiding people, avoiding situations. This can be exhausting. There are many people who are called what we would identify, who may identify as covert people who stammer. So they can navigate the vocabulary around words and you swap words around or order of sentences, but this is pretty much exhausting doing so. And in turn, negative thoughts and feelings are other secondary behaviors we identify. Fear, shame, guilt, mind reading. What is that person thinking about my talking? Okay. Joseph Sheehan was a psychologist and he died in the 80s. He has his analogy of stuttering is related to an iceberg. The part everybody sees is at the top, the loss of eye contact, the repetition of sounds, blinking, body movements, things like that. That's what everybody sees. However, his theory is that underneath is the larger part of the iceberg, the thing people don't see. Swapping words around, fear of certain words, embarrassment, frustration, avoiding situations, avoiding people. And I suppose Sheehan looks at the person who stutters rather than the stutter itself. A more modern, and sorry, that just explains it. You can read that later. Yeah. So describing stuttering, another way is looking at a temporally distorted sound and the reaction to it. Okay. The overt features and covert. So as I said, overt are the things people see, the repetitions, and covert are the less obvious features. So people avoiding words or swapping words around. So people who appear to stutter in their heads, not their mouths. We look at stuttering as how much it may bother somebody versus the severity. So we wouldn't identify somebody and say they have a severe stutter unless they said it themselves. We may look at how much their stutter bothers them. Okay. Another way of describing stuttering, if you could just go back there, Georgina. Yeah, thank you. Another way of describing stuttering would be to look at a point, okay? And basically we start with a point as the updated iceberg analogy. The top part, so just pause it there for a sec. Yeah, the top part is the behaviors and the bottom part are the emotions, the feelings, things like that. The bottom part is where the good stuff, it's the significant stuff, it's the stuff that takes time to change. Therapy can reduce both of these areas. So as you see in this part of the photo, the negativity has reduced. So the black part, the bit people don't see, the fear, the negativity, that part is reduced, but some of it is still there to an extent. But there's definitely some stuttering, and that can cling to the side of the glass, maybe like a good pint. But then there's, looking at, is there anything really bad about stuttering, or is it just how other people perceive it? It is okay to stutter. In this last piece of the picture, we can see, can a person who stutters get to this point? If stuttering is neurological, then perhaps there's always going to be a bit of stuttering remaining at certain times, when somebody is under pressure, in a hurry, stressed, sick, or being asked 17 million questions at once. But can it just be okay? Can we have much less negative feelings, emotions for somebody? And speech and language therapy and people who work with people who stutter would say, yes, it is possible. And it ties in to how much it bothers the individual. For some, they might struggle to reduce this negative impact. And for some, they might continue to stutter in how they might perceive it as severely at times. But it depends on how you measure it. Okay. So stammering and avoidance. Avoidance is a significant feature of stammering. If you look at the cup of tea here, maybe that person wanted a cup of coffee, but tea was going to be difficult, or coffee was going to be difficult to say, so they asked for a cup of tea. This is where we're looking at how much it impacts. There's a person I know who will get on a bus and go to a different location because he couldn't say the location he really wanted to get to, and he would have to get off and walk back the distance. So that level of avoidance can be quite significant for some people. People will avoid sounds. They'll avoid certain sounds that they feel they can't say. They'll avoid certain words, situations, feelings, relationships. Some people may not identify themselves as a person who stutters, or they may identify themselves, so but may not be open to discussing it. Avoidance for going to jobs, interviews, opportunities. All these things are really a big feature of stammering. And the different levels are intertwined. They're not necessarily sequential. You may not stutter at one person and you may stutter with another. Okay. Georgina then.
Yeah, thanks for that, Aisling. So just to touch on that, so obviously as a vocational barrier, so a study that was undertaken, Understanding Stammering, a guide for employers, and this was undertaken by STAMA, who are the British Stammering Association. It has been found that many employers hold negative attitudes towards people who stammer, and this can impact on the likelihood of successful recruitment or promotion. Recent research has indicated that people who stammer face daily casual discrimination at work, that the normal recruitment process with interview militates against them, and that they often do not achieve their potential but settle for menial jobs with little communication demands. Now, as we're working with people, this is not a one-size-fits-all situation, as we all know. We have great leaders as people who stammer as well. For example, President Joe Biden of the United States. We also have Ian Wilkie, who was a previous partner in Ernst & Young for a number of years, and now heads an organization called 50 Million Voices that we partner with on an international basis. But these are people who stammer as well. So I suppose we can't make an assumption that somebody who stammers will settle for a menial job with little communication demands, but it's just to bear that in mind that it can be a barrier. So looking at some of the challenges for somebody who stammers, and these are everyday situations that we may be faced with in work. So for example, the first one is, say, a brainstorming session that you'd be having in work. The second is an intercom. We also have a telephone there, Zoom, and then a more formal kind of meeting. And I suppose just to bear in mind that, you know, a person who stammers does not have an inability to use an intercom or an inability to use a telephone, but it is in fact, as Aisling had mentioned, the time pressures that they're under. So for example, when they press the intercom button and somebody says hello, all of a sudden they have to get the word out. And it's all of that that's happening underneath the iceberg. Is now going to be the time that I stammer? Can I say this word? All of that is going underneath the surface. To touch on around Zoom as well, I mean, as we all know, the world has changed with Zoom and with the introduction of Zoom. And some people who stammer find working in a Zoom setting quite beneficial, because they can continue to be involved in the conversation through either the chat function or the Q&A function without actually having to speak. But again, we have to ask, is that kind of allowing them to be in this space of avoidance a little bit more? So in a Zoom setting, it's about encouraging somebody to get involved, maybe highlighting to them beforehand that I'll be asking for input later on. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. But just to highlight that these are some of the challenges that somebody who stammers faces every day going into work. And what we want to ask ourselves really is, how can we create a space in the workplace that is supportive and inclusive for somebody who stammers? So how do we go about that? There are a couple of things that we recommend, and I suppose some of these recommendations, well, all of these recommendations would come from our experience of working with people who stammer. I've been working with people who stammer in this setting since 2019, so we have good experience and vast experience across both, you know, the online experience and then back to the face-to-face. But looking at the initial application process, and I know that this is something that Employers for Change are also keen on, is in terms of looking at the description and the job description itself. Instead of describing the person that you want, perhaps look at describing the role instead. As a person who stammers, if I see excellent communication skills on a job description, I may decide, no, I'm not going to go for that. And automatically there's that barrier there that has been created. So what we'd encourage employers to do is to look at, you know, describing what the actual task is. So those excellent communication skills may be purely report writing. If that's the case, specify that so that the person who stammers is not automatically excluding themselves. I suppose one of the things that we want to look at is, are we creating a space for disclosure? And from our experience, people who stammer really have very little space for disclosure. And this is because of a couple of reasons. As a person who stammers, I may not assume or I suppose identify as somebody with a disability. Whereas another portion or another person who stammers would describe themselves as having a disability. So we can't make that assumption that being a person who stammers, I would describe myself with a disability. Therefore, when it comes to the application process and you're asking the question, do you need reasonable accommodations for or to support a disability? As a person who stammers, looking at that application, I'm not automatically fitting in that box. And that's what we find in working with people who stammer, is that very often when there are boxes, they're still not fitting in them. So what we want to do is to create as much opportunity on a number of occasions for somebody who stammers to make the disclosure. Also, we don't want to make any assumption that being a person who stammers would preclude somebody from carrying out the role. And again, we know from working with people who stammer that they would automatically make that assumption sometimes themselves. But we need to look at, our own unconscious bias sometimes when it comes to these things, and creating the opportunity. The next place that we could look at creating a stammering inclusive workplace is in relation to the interview. And I suppose this really requires us to have that space for disclosure initially. So through the application process, if you are asking for the space for disclosure there, but we would also invite employers to look at creating another space for disclosure when it comes to the interview invitation. So, for example, during the application process, I may not feel that I'm ready or willing to disclose that I am a person who stammers, maybe from fear of bias or prejudice or anything like that. But what we would encourage people to do is, when sending out the interview invitation, to then ask another question: do you need reasonable accommodations for dysfluency or stammering? I have a recommended wording later on, but really what we want to do is to create as much opportunity as possible. I know from working with people who stammer that it is the kind of build up to the interview itself that is where the anxiety is created. And often, as Aisling has kind of mentioned with Sheen's kind of iceberg theory, giving a person permission to stammer can really allow them to just relax a little bit more and put their best selves forward for the interview, which is what we all want. So some of those reasonable accommodations that we would recommend people to look for when it comes to an interview is to request additional time. Now, we're not looking for an additional half hour or hour. It's just a couple of minutes, so 5-10 minutes. And that, as we all know, like, interviews can be quite an intense situation and a long day for everybody, especially those doing interviews. So if we can allow additional time for somebody who stammers, we're under less pressure and both parties can be a little bit more relaxed. Another suggestion for a reasonable accommodation, Aisling kindly made this one, is to request to either be first or last on the day of the interview. Again, relieving a little bit of the time pressure that would be experienced perhaps more in the middle of the day. We can also help to create a more stammering inclusive workplace by training our interviewers. Basically, there are a number of ways that we can support a person who stammers, and we'll go through that in a little bit more detail. But just to let you know that the ISA does outreach to individual employers as well. So if it's something that your organization would like, you can link in with us afterwards. The next space that we have an opportunity to help increase, I suppose, inclusivity in the workplace is in relation to onboarding. So when we've put in the time, the effort, the money, the energy into recruiting somebody for a position, we want to, at that stage, again, create an opportunity for disclosure. Is it a conversation that they want to have, or is it a case that they would like supports put in place for them, perhaps in a team meeting situation, or do they just want to go in and do their job? Each person has their own individual experience around being a person who stammers. So it's very much around having that conversation or creating the opportunity to have that conversation. The next place for a stammering inclusive workplace is around promotion, and it goes right back to the start of the cycle again. So it's all about looking at how you describe the opportunity for promotion that is coming up. So again, in terms of promotion, we have worked with people who stammer who would be reluctant to go forward for team leading positions or a more client-facing role because of their misconceptions of what the role is going to be. So again, we would look and request employers to look at how they are describing the role internally to people. And again, just about supporting that person who stammers throughout. So when it comes to the interview itself, and I suppose this is also very relevant in a day-to-day basis in talking and communicating with somebody who stammers, there are a couple of things that we can do to support them. The first thing would be to maintain eye contact, and I suppose maintain as natural eye contact as possible. We want to show and demonstrate to a person who stammers, who perhaps is experiencing a block, that can be quite challenging for them. We want to demonstrate to them that we are still interested, that we are still listening. The second thing would be to not complete their sentences. So to try not to jump in and finish the sentence for them. And also try not to invite them to take their time or relax. And I suppose understanding that, you know, this can often be a natural response for a lot of us when we see somebody struggling in that way. You know, we'd say, take your time, relax. But really what we want to do is, instead of saying those things, we'd like to be able to create a space that is, you know, that the person assumes that they have time. They are in a more relaxed space so that they can take their time. Time-wise, you know, the other option is to give them additional time in the interview and to let them know that. So, you know, we have an extra 10 minutes, don't worry, you know, so that is all clear from the very beginning. I suppose this goes without saying in a lot of circumstances, but be patient and understanding as much as possible. The person who stammers is struggling when they're experiencing those blocks or any of those, I suppose, the above the iceberg things that Aisling was talking about. So just to give them a little bit of time, and even allowing silence, that can also be very supportive for somebody who stammers. And I suppose just to mention that giving any of these supports can greatly reduce the impact and increase the person's confidence. And when we increase their confidence and give them permission to stammer, permission to be themselves, they can then bring their best self forward to the interview and to the job. So just, I suppose, from my experience and our experience in the Irish Stammering Association, to give you a couple of examples of people that we have worked with and their own experience of interview itself and work. I've changed the names of the people, obviously, but the first person was Michael, and Michael came to us through our employment support clinics that we run monthly. And he came after a bad experience in an interview where he wasn't supported or understood, and left the interview with very negative feelings about himself. After that interview itself, he had understandably built up anxiety around the interview and the interview process itself. So we worked with Michael in a number of one-to-one sessions and supported him in terms of rebuilding his confidence, I suppose, and also in a number of group sessions around areas of presentation skills and interview techniques. But Michael's major inhibition when it came to the interview process was around disclosure. Because of that negative experience where he was misunderstood in an interview, he was unwilling to disclose and had very built up anxiety around it. After we worked with him for a while, he decided, he did have an interview coming up, and decided to make the disclosure to the employer in advance of the interview. We agreed the context with which that would happen, and then the disclosure was made in advance of the interview itself. When I worked with Michael the next day after we had done that, when I saw him, he looked like a different person. His body language changed, his shoulders were more relaxed, he was more open, his speech was clearer and more confident. So I suppose in that issue, or in making that disclosure, his anxiety was greatly relaxed, because instead of walking into the interview room with an elephant on his back. The elephant had been discussed before he got into the room. So Michael had gone for the interview. He wasn't successful with that particular one, but he went for a number of interviews afterwards and then secured full-time employment. Another individual that came forward to us was Peter. Peter came to us actually through a third level college. He had been struggling to secure an internship, and the internship was part of his degree program. He was recommended to us and we worked with him. And I suppose, like for Peter, he had this interpretation that being a person who stammers is holding him back and that it will continue to hold him back. So what we did is we worked with him, again, in a number of ways. So through one-to-one supports, through a number of coaching sessions, practice interviews, group interviews. And basically he understood then that, you know, an employer is looking for him based on his skills and his knowledge, which he was really, really good at. So he overcame this identity that he was being held back by a stammer and was successful in securing an internship. Now, he was in that internship literally a matter of 5 or 6 weeks, and they turned around and gave him an offer of full-time employment post his college course. So he's gone on to do great things, and that's always from the level of work of the individual as well. I suppose to mention from my own perspective of working with people who stammer, I've worked with long-term unemployed people for a number of years, and people with mental health issues and various disabilities and so on. And I've always learned great things. But in working with people who stammer, the one thing that I have really learned is how to listen. So I suppose in creating this space for people who stammer to disclose, to become more inclusive in our workplace, they can teach us amazing things about ourselves and our listening skills as well. So moving forward, a couple of recommendations that we make. When it comes to the recruitment process, the wording that we have suggested to a number of organizations before that have been implemented with great success is, do you require additional time at interview to accommodate stammering or dysfluency? Again, this has been implemented by a number of organizations. It's very cost effective. You can implement it at the application process, and again, when you're sending out the interview invitation. Research. So as we mentioned earlier, there has been a piece of research done by STAMA in 2017, but we are always looking for research on in an Irish context, really, and with international potential as well. But we're really looking for the employment perspective of stammering and the workplace. We have a number of projects coming up during the year and a number of ideas. So we would invite anybody that would like to collaborate with us in this space to please get in touch with us. But really, how else can you get involved? The main thing is to share our information with your staff. We know from working with people who stammer that yes, it is the person who stammers who is affected, but it can also be family and close friends and so on. So on that basis, we run a number of support groups, children's support groups, parent support groups, adult support groups, a number of social events and family events, as well as employment and education support. So often when we do these talks in organizations, a lot of the questions that can come up can be based around family members or friends or anything like that. So in sharing our information with your organization or within your organization, yes, you could be helping somebody in a work context, but you could also be helping somebody outside of work as well. We also invite people to get involved in mentoring with us. We have a number of people who stammer who say at the later stages of their career would be looking to progress and support other people. So there's always opportunities for that. And also volunteering. Specifically at the moment, we are looking for support around HR and policy implementation and updating. So again, if there's any organization that wants to get involved with us, we would make the call to reach out. But thank you. I hope that everybody got the information that they needed. If you do need further information, we have plenty of resources available on our website as well. Also the links to any upcoming events. I'd like to just take the opportunity to thank Christabel for supporting us and creating this space for us to come in and speak about stammering and what we understand and know about it, and how we can all really help to create the space for people who stammer to walk into their best selves. Thank you.
Thanks, Jordina. That's super. And thanks for, you've stopped sharing screen there now. So we should, yeah, we can see everybody on the screen there. Thanks very much. That was absolutely brilliant. A brilliant presentation from Georgina and Aisling. We've gotten some really great kind of questions and comments there. So I know Aisling has answered some of them directly, but I suppose one of the things that has come up there, one of the first kind of piece of feedback was around the importance of disclosure, which you touched on really, really well. And kind of, I suppose, the question of, does that really, the success of people's ability to share or disclose that they have a stammer, does that really start from primary school and actually giving people the support? Because we also had a second person comment that they themselves have a child who is in school, and that they have found that the child has progressed so well since they actually made the school aware of his stammer, and that now he's actually much more confident in sharing thoughts and speaking in class, and not being maybe as anxious about doing that.
It can actually, sorry, just to say, it can start even before primary school. So we would have 2-year-olds who are starting to stammer, and that's when parents are encouraged to be open about stammering, to be neutral in their responses to stammering, and not rewarding fluent speech versus bumpy speech, because it is all just communicating. So yes, from an early age, if that's the way a family communicate in an open and honest manner about stammering, there's no room for a stigma then.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a big thing. It's, I suppose, normalizing, isn't it? It's being accepting and understanding, and just treating people and children with respect, and so they feel like they're valued, and that it's not as an anxious situation to be thinking about before you're going in speaking to a new person. Somebody actually there said, why can people sometimes feel uncomfortable when speaking or meeting with a disfluent person?
Do you want me to answer that as
Yeah.
well? So it's Aisling here. So there is research showing that people who stammer feel that same reaction to stammering as someone who doesn't stammer. It's a disruption in the communication. So the general natural to and fro has been adjusted, and not sometimes if a person who stammers is comfortable communicating with this disruption, it's really, it can be just the problem or the difficulty for the listener. And that really looking at the general rules of talking, concentrating on what is being said rather than how it's being said, can ease a lot of the discomforts that people may feel.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes total, that we can all, when you say that out loud, we can all understand it. And it seems so obvious that of course would cause people to be kind of awkward or unsure of themselves. Another one here, a number of great tips today, thank you. Is it possible to get a copy of these wording suggestions for the recruitment process? So I'm sure we can share those with anybody that has signed up after this. And we'll also share the a more general inclusive recruitment toolkit that Employers for Change and Open Doors did a number of weeks ago as well. We will share that with it. So you'll get both the information from the Irish Stammering Association, and then we'll give you kind of a more general document as well for inclusion. Did you want to say something else there, Aisling?
No, I'm okay.
So then we had, and again, Aisling has answered to these directly, but I just think for anybody else on it, it might be useful. So if a person hasn't asked for an accommodation, but they're struggling in the interview, what should people do? Like this person here is saying, look, given extra time, it isn't always possible as the interviews are scheduled and time sensitive. So do either you want to take that?
Well, I suppose, you know, if one option would be perhaps to give them the opportunity to re-interview. I know that has happened on occasion before for people who stammer, but also for people in other situations as well. But I suppose if they have not asked for an accommodation, I suppose the first question is, are we creating that space for them to disclose? As I kind of mentioned, you know, a lot of opportunities for disclosure actually would discriminate, would be the wrong word, but exclude people who stammer because they don't necessarily fit in the box. So I suppose it's making that opportunity for disclosure as wide open as possible.
Yeah, and I suppose I would probably say, even from a broader context around interviews and being time sensitive, as an organization, we all have to ask ourselves, what are our priorities? So I know I certainly have never gone to an interview where a couple of people have been before me that it's been on time. So if we can allow that to happen in a general context, then surely we should be prioritizing people who do have maybe just a need for, as you said during this presentation, a couple of minutes. If we want to get people, the best people for roles, if we want to get the diversity within our organizations and build a sense of inclusion, it all comes back down to what their real commitment here.
I might suggest as well that sometimes if someone has gotten as far as being invited for an interview, that they have a lot of the qualifications already. So it is about, you know, being specific in the interview around the materials that the person has prepared. And if they are struggling, maybe it can be followed up afterwards, like Georgina said, like we re-interview, or even just by email where they can cover what needs to be covered.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually that leads me to a question I had, which is in terms of the interviews. So obviously we're in a scenario now where there's still lots of organizations that will do virtual interviews and do the interview online and things like that. And of course, they're very useful and very inclusive for people with certain disabilities. But I'm just wondering, for people who have a stammer, is that creating more barriers or is it removing barriers? You know, and for the interviewers as well, like we talked there about tips around making eye contact, things like that. So how does that translate into this virtual world where we're looking at a screen?
Yeah, and I suppose, like, you know, that it can be, it really depends on the individual themselves, but I would say that Zoom has definitely opened up a lot of doors for people. They're in their own home environment, they feel more comfortable, you know, in terms of making eye contact, you know, it's a little bit easier for them to avoid eye contact in certain situations, but they can still be looking at the camera. So I would say that Zoom itself is actually, you know, as long as being a person who stammers has been disclosed beforehand, because if somebody is experiencing a block, so and then, you know, the person who is interviewing might think that it's the internet connection. So things like that, and having that discussion beforehand so that both parties are aware. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you did. And just to say to people actually as well on that, if you yourself or if you know somebody who you know, has a disability or is from some other marginalized background and they require a little bit of extra support around interviewing and things like that, I do know that the Open Doors initiative has recently put up a piece from Modern Hire, where there's an opportunity where people can actually go in and create a free account, and you can actually do interview prep where questions will be asked in this kind of virtual space, and you'll get the recording back. And just for practice and ease of practice and things like that, that might be useful for some people on the call. Just then, I'm trying to see, do we have any other? You've got loads of feedback of that was an excellent presentation. Regarding a third level student with a stammer since childhood, has no accommodation but has to give a class or group presentation, what should we offer?
I work with a number of people like that would be experiencing this at the moment. I suppose to access the formal disability support and accommodations in third level, they do need to go to a speech and language therapist and have the report for that to go through the psychological services there. But like, you know, there's always approaches that you can make on a more informal basis. But I would say, you know, if this is a case that you need additional support on, please reach out, because it is something that we do support people with as well.
Mm-hmm. Another person has actually asked as well, it seems kind when communicating with somebody who stammers to acknowledge it and to assure them to take their time. Would they not appreciate that understanding, and also would make the other person feel more comfortable?
Sometimes that can be very, sometimes it can be kind to do. Sometimes it can be kind to acknowledge it, but if you think about it now, they have to remember to take their time as well. So there's an additional complication added in, because the person who stammers knows what they want to say already. There's no difficulty there. The difficulty is the word coming out. So when we maybe even interrupt or say, you know, take your time, it can add that little bit of time pressure on somebody who go, oh, I have to now remember to take my time. And while it is kind, some people might not appreciate it. And yes, it can be a difficult one. Really saying less is more. Giving them, showing them that there's time is much more powerful.
Can I add in there as well? I suppose, like, if you are a person who stammers and you have heard people say your entire life, take your time, relax. You know, it's like saying to somebody, not like, for want of a better kind of illustration, it's like saying to somebody in the middle of a panic attack, calm down. You know, I suppose it's just to kind of be, yeah, exactly. So even though sometimes we think that we're doing the best thing, it's really to understand, and I suppose that's where the iceberg comes in again. It's to understand everything that they're experiencing underneath. So to understand and even feel, you know, their level of frustration that they have experienced, not just in this moment, but their entire life. So to kind of understand and see if you can support that as well.
Yeah, and I think probably listening to your presentation, both of you talking, the biggest thing is this is actually an opportunity for people to truly listen.
Absolutely.
And also to maybe challenge yourself on your own discomfort with a little bit of silence, because actually sometimes, while people have the best will in the world, ask them, tell somebody to take their time can often just be a case of you're not comfortable with the silence, and so you feel the need to say something that's actually not particularly helpful to the individual. So I suppose it's a lot of this is about supporting people, but it's also challenging our own discomfort in scenarios, and how do we work on ourselves as much as how do we support somebody else. So I think it's definitely a huge opportunity for listening, and we can all do it a little bit of a little bit more around listening. I think every single one of us. Do either of you? I don't see any other kind of questions per se, but if today, I suppose I'd ask both of you, if a person was going away from this today and they were saying to themselves, there's a lot we need to do in the organization, what would be the number one thing? And I'm going to ask each of you to give something different. What would be the number one thing that you would say to people as a colleague or as somebody who might prospectively be interviewing people within the organization? What's the one thing they can do to make a huge difference?
I might go first because Georgina's going to have a lot more useful information, but from a speech and language point of view, you said it there, Christabel, less is more. So learning to be comfortable in a silence. I had to train myself to be comfortable in a silence. I was known to fill in a gap, you know, even the little fillers we all use, like but or what was I going to say, or all those words. If you can remove those from conversation and be comfortable with the silence, a silence can be a long time and it can feel uncomfortable, but if you can learn to be comfortable in that silence, you're supporting so many people in communication, not just a person who stammers. You're supporting so many other people who may have communication needs. So it's just what you were saying, learn to be a better listener and listen to the content, not how the person's speaking, listen to what they're saying.
Yeah. Well said, Aisling. I would also say, I suppose, the one thing that you can do, and this is, I suppose it's a big thing, but also a number of small things, is to create that space for listening and to really kind of reflect on, do we have the opportunity to listen? And that even begins at the very start with the opportunities for disclosure. So taking the time to reflect and just simply ask, do we have space for inclusivity, really, not just for people who stammer, but in general.
Brilliant. Well, look, I found it really, really informative myself here this morning. I think that, you know, stammering is probably something we all know somebody. We might be related to somebody who is a stammerer, but even at that, we still might not have had the knowledge that we hopefully are moving away from today's session with. We will share with people the slides from today's presentation, and we'll also share some of those tips that people have asked about. So within that, you'll obviously have Sheehan's iceberg, and we'll also have some information from Georgina and Aisling around the language that we can use when we're asking about reasonable accommodations for people who have a stammer. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining. Thank you to Bernadette, who has done a stellar job of interpreting all of us talking very quickly at times, me in particular. So thank you very much for that. And thanks so much to Aisling and Georgina and everybody who took the time this morning. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christabel. Thank you, everyone, Bernadette.